Welcome to Instruction Discussion, our weekly look at the latest topics and trends in education affecting schools here on Long Island and schools around the world. Whether you're a teacher, parent, or student, listen for tips and strategies to help you navigate the educational landscape. There's a bell. It's time to start today's Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hello, I'm Kevin Boston Hill, and welcome to Instruction Discussion, where each week we will examine a recent trend or development in education and its impact on Long Island. It is a widely held belief that parents are our child's first teachers. In keeping with this belief, parents spend a great deal of time teaching their children about language and reading by reading to them. They think that this is enough to make sure their children are ready for school. Unfortunately, many parents, such as our next guest, found that their children's reading progress was lacking by the time they reached school age. The approach of reading the bedtime story isn't as effective as once thought, and if gone uncorrected, can have devastating effects. In fact, there are currently 43 million Americans between the age of 16 and 65 who can't read well enough to complete a job application, follow a bus schedule, understand a rental agreement, or even parse choices at the ballot box. Well, to help us understand how the brain architecture develops rapidly during infancy and how parents need to be better equipped to play the role of their child's first teacher, today we welcome award-winning journalist and author of the book Reading for Our Lives, a literacy action plan from birth to six, Ms. Maya Payne Smart. Welcome to Instruction Discussion on 90.3 WHPC.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to chat today.
Well, I'm glad that you were able to come on to have this conversation. So let's kind of get right on into it. And what prompted you to actually write this book?
I have always been a book lover, was an early reader myself, and had just a strong desire for my daughter to follow in my footsteps. But because I was an early reader, I don't have any memories of learning to read. I didn't remember exactly how I was taught. I didn't even have any memories of my parents reading to me. My dad would recount the story of me being really young and being frustrated when people would try to read stories to me because I wanted to do it myself. So I went into it thinking that I did not know what I was doing. And so put on my researcher hat and started just reading a lot of news articles and asking questions to figure out what exactly does it take to raise a reader. And as my daughter was getting older, I also saw in news accounts really vast disparities between reading rates or reading achievement among Black students and white students and lower socioeconomic students and higher socioeconomic students. So I just really wanted to know what specifically accounted for those differences. It seemed too vague to say it was the household income or it was the race, when we know that there's variation in reading ability, even among people who are low income or even among people who are Black. So I really just wanted to dig into the detail so that I could do a great job with my own daughter.
No, I know as a former administrator myself, one of the things that the research that I've come across was, yes, there's this academic achievement gap that exists between or among lower income and students of color and their white counterparts. And part of that is this vocabulary deficiency that develops at a very young age. And I think by the time children get into kindergarten, that gap that exists in vocabulary is something like 20,000 words that some students know more than others. So we think that by reading to our children, that's going to close that gap by getting them exposed at least to the extra reading in those words that we give them. So I guess what you're saying therefore is that's not enough. What more needs to be done to help close that particular achievement gap?
Well, a couple of things. One, most parents don't read to their child every day. So even though that advice is given, read to your child every day for 20 minutes or an hour or whatever, the fact of the matter is that a lot of parents, given work and fatigue and stress and the pandemic and all these things, aren't able to do that as consistently as they would like. And that's if they have books in the house. A lot of homes don't have access to books. There are book deserts across this country. So that's part of it, that there's this ideal of reading every night, and then there's the reality of people not doing it. But I think with the research, indicated, and it's actually good news for parents, is that these important vocabulary building, knowledge building, brain building conversations that you can have with kids don't always have to occur with a book in hand. So picture books often do have more sophisticated vocabulary or introduce kids to ideas beyond their everyday experience. But just by having a conversation with a child about what's going on in your home or your neighborhood or just any of the things you're doing throughout your day, those words count. So as parents, it's important to think of yourself as a teacher and recognize that you're building vocabulary so that you're saying more than sit down, be quiet, don't do that. So we see wide variations in how much parents talk to kids. But the key thing that I also learned from the research is that it's also about what we allow kids to give back to us. So it really is a conversation and a duet. So when we're talking about infants who aren't even speaking in words yet, they're cooing, they're babbling. As parents, we have to learn to recognize that that is an important part of their development and that it really is a conversation. And we have to look and see where they're pointing, look where their eyes are gazing toward and engage with them. Oh, you see the dog? Yes, the dog is brown, it's barking. And ask questions to give them an opportunity to say something, even again, if it's not a word that you recognize, it's a babble. Someday those babbles will be words that you recognize.
So I guess what you're saying then, it's really important to start those conversations and having conversations with your children at an early age, even though we may think that on the surface they're not understanding us. They really are. They just haven't developed the linguistic ability to reflect what it is that they are actually processing, but they're processing.
Yes, they're learning and growing. And so parents will think, oh, it's just this baby is just a little lump. They don't understand. One day they will, and it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen with just a turn of the page of the calendar. It's the sort of subtle accumulation over time of all this learning that we can't see unless we take the time to really tune in and listen, ask questions and respond.
Yeah. So I was thinking, so then therefore, like you said, it's a lot more than just the reading 20 minutes, that formal reading of 20 minutes a day. It's the daily conversation that you have with your child, answering the questions, spotting where they're looking and responding to that. It's really not speaking to them in baby talk, as we say, but in using your normal everyday adult words and speech patterns, because that's what's going to help them to develop a little bit more.
Absolutely. And all of those words that you speak to them verbally out loud are words that they'll need to have some understanding of when they do begin reading, so that what they're reading makes sense. So that they're not encountering pages of words that they've never heard in conversation. So that's one piece of it. But also as they get older, we can talk in ways, again, even without a book in hand, that teach them some of the things that they need to know that are crucial for eventually reading. We can talk about things like letter shapes, just bringing their attention to print. With little kids, oftentimes they don't recognize when you're reading a book that you're reading those little squiggles on the page. They're thinking you're reading the story, that you just happen to tell that story the same way every time. So we have to kind of bring their attention to the print. That can be as simple as dragging your finger from left to right across the page as you read. That's teaching them how text moves, that it moves from the top of the page to the bottom. And even without a book in hand, you can teach them that all letters are made up of lines, dots, and curves. You can say things like, that's the letter A. A says add, like an apple, and it's made of 3 lines, 2 long lines. One goes like this, one goes like this, and a little one connects the two. And again, all of those little simple lessons that any parent who knows the alphabet can teach are really effective. There's a lot of illustrations and text on a page in a book that can be distracting, but in those moments when you just want to teach a letter, which is critically important for reading down the road, you can do that with just a sheet of paper or a graphic t-shirt or a stop sign or whatever is in your environment that has a letter printed on it.
Now, of course, the the teachers and the reading teachers, especially out there listening to us right now, they're like, oh yeah, we do this all the time. We know this is old hat to us, but to parents and to caregivers who are just hearing this for the first time, they may be thinking, wow, there's that much that goes into reading and to recognizing letters and shapes and all. Because I guess when you really break it down into the component pieces, which is what you really have to do for children, especially at that age, it sounds like it becomes a very daunting task. But is it really a daunting task, or is it just that it seems like it's so much because you're breaking it down and getting into the real nitty gritty of it all?
I think it's helpful for people to understand all that goes into reading so that they can be attentive to the little parts of it that they can do easily in everyday life. So that really is a lesson, just saying, oh, look at that stop sign, S says that right there, that sentence or two was a lesson. And if you point that out every time you walk by the stop sign, or, the V at Valvoline when you drive by the oil change place, and all these things are, at least the way I've described them in the book, are simple and straightforward enough that I think most parents could do them consistently and effectively. It's just a matter of you knowing that it's important for you to do that. Because a lot of parents think, well, they're going to do that in school. And the reality is that school is not what we recall. And that's if we had a good experience in school back in the day. School, particularly after COVID, is just a whole another ball game in terms of teacher shortages and teacher training problems. And kids are entering classrooms, a teacher is arriving expecting to teach second graders. And they're realizing that they're getting kids coming in with preschool skills because kids didn't get what they needed. So that teacher has to be able to address a much wider array of needs in the classroom than parents realize. And there's only so much that can be accomplished in the span of a year with even the best teacher. So I've talked to second grade teachers who say they have second graders coming in that don't know any letter names, that don't know how to write their name, that don't know how to handle scissors. So it's just, I think it's a much bigger challenge than parents realize. And if we knew that, we would do the little things that we could do to help. And it helps our child, of course. It helps that teacher as well.
You're right. And I know when my children were growing up, when they were at that age level, that birth to 6 years, I would always do sight words with them. And it would be just whatever words I happened to recognize or see, whether we were traveling on the road or if we were in the store or things like that, it would just be different words that I would point out to them so that they could start to recognize these words. And it would be a lot easier for them to then transfer that recognition to other words, because especially words that either looked the same or sounded the same, they would have a more of a foundation, at least, to be able to address those new words that they were coming across. And it all began with the simple sight words. I remember taking my son on the highway and pointing out exit, E-X-I-T. And then after a while, he would recognize and say exit, E-X-I-T. And he would just do that really without even my prompting him. And I think that's what we really have to remind our parents, that any little moment can become that teachable moment that will help our students to start to close those gaps before they get into kindergarten.
And that example of driving down the street and pointing out signage, it comes up again and again when I talk to people about their reading experiences, because a lot of people remember long car trips before everyone had tablets and cell phones. And you would play those games and look out of the window and look to see certain things on license plates or, as you're driving around passing. So all that signage, that environmental print, those are wonderful prompts to remind parents. You can make it a lesson if you just bring their attention to the print and teach them something about it. I also heard a funny story last month from a mom who was shocked to discover that her son was the king of kindergarten and that he was reading at a much more advanced level than other kids in his class. And she hadn't done anything in particular to teach him, she thought. But what it turned out was he had learned through, her family did karaoke parties. And so people were singing and he was hearing certain songs over and over again. And they had a little monitor that showed the words lighting up as they were sung. And just over time, through who knows how many years of watching karaoke, he made the connection between what he was hearing and what he was saying. So there are all kinds of ways to impart these skills in everyday life in the time you already spend with your child.
And and that makes a lot of sense with the karaoke, because one of the ways that we reach the preschool age children is through song. And by creating songs, I mean, the alphabet song, I mean, that was one of the first songs that all kids learn, and Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and all those things. So I guess, yeah, doing karaoke might be the way to teach children how to, not just how to read, but about phonemic awareness and phonics and all those other things that go into reading and recognition of words as well.
With the alphabet song, one thing I always like, a couple of things I like to point out to people, because that's a common one that most parents will sing, that sometimes we're slurring all those letters together, like LMNOP. So I say sing the song definitely, but every now and then just kind of say it and break those letters apart so they recognize. And then also in singing that song, they're learning letter names, but they aren't necessarily learning their connection to letters in print. So if you can sing the song and point to the A or point to the B, and you don't have to turn it into a boring, intense work session, but just casually every now and then, just make that connection. The A that we're singing about, in shows like Sesame Street, make that connection as well. So just keep in mind when you're talking about letter names that there's a visual that helps.
You are listening to Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Kevin Boston Hill, and our guest today is award-winning journalist and author of the book Reading for Our Lives, A Literacy Action Plan from Birth to Six, Maya Payne Smart. Now, let's get into a little bit more of the conventional reading tools and instruction. What is it about the way that schools and teachers use to teach reading? What's it that's lacking in and contributing to these reading disparities that we recognize now?
Unfortunately, a lot of the kids who need the most support in becoming readers in school settings are in schools where teachers haven't been well trained to teach reading. So often teachers haven't been taught how to help kids make those letter sound connections. They haven't been taught about phonemic awareness, which is the ability to hear the sounds within words, to know that cat has 3 sounds, and how to blend those and break them apart and change the to make mat, and all this sort of wordplay and games and kind of details of blending and segmenting and recognizing sounds within words. A lot of teachers don't have that experience at that kind of granular level to teach that to a child who's missing it, or even to recognize that the child doesn't hear the sound and then therefore can't sound the word out when they see it in print. So there's a lot of teachers have been instructed in almost children's literature or picture book appreciation. So they're doing a lot of read alouds and they're sharing wonderful literature with kids, but they aren't necessarily teaching the details of how to read to the ones that need it. And here there's also a lot of private tutoring. So some kids are getting these skills not from school, but they're getting it from tutoring centers in their community, paid private companies. So kids even as young as preschool here are being tutored. And so the teacher in some cases think they're more successful at teaching reading because of the kids in their class who have picked it up and seem to be reading, but it's not a result of that teacher's instruction necessarily. It could be the result of things that their parents did or things that their parents paid for. So that's another thing that I point out in the book, that there are sort of many paths to reading. There are certain foundational skills that every reader must get. Some will pick it up more easily, more quickly, but most need direct, explicit, systematic instruction in phonics.
So other than hiring a reading tutor at home and so forth, what are some of the things, or what can parents or caregivers do to help prepare their children for that literacy success? Parents
have to remember that they are teachers. So we talked about vocabulary, all the words that you're pointing and labeling in your everyday environment, sort of concrete objects, table, chair, plant, all those things. But then also through picture books, you can introduce them to other vocabulary describing places that aren't in your immediate environment. The vocabulary is a big one. So talk to kids more than you think you need to and really do try to make it a conversation and follow their interests and try to expand and build on the conversation just to keep getting that turn taking that contributes so much to their development down the road. Then nursery rhymes, word play, different games, again, where we're manipulating the sounds within words are super important for helping them read. Also, building print awareness is something parents can teach. And that's what we talked about earlier, that helping them recognize the difference between a number and a letter. We forget that all of these things are kids have to be taught or recognized over time. They don't know that a 3 is different in some way than a D or whatever the case may be, or it's different than just a line or scribble on a piece of paper. So bring their attention to print, building letter knowledge, talking about letter names, shapes, sounds. I always recommend that parents teach the most common sounds for a given letter. So the letter C most commonly is pronounced like in cat or canopy or cape. So you don't have to feel like as a parent that you need to know every single nuance of phonics, but teach the basics, what you are confident in and what you do know. Feel confident in teaching that and sharing it with your child.
I know your book goes into a lot of detail on these strategies. So what are some of those strategies that you mentioned in the book? I know you have like I think 6 strategies that you really outline that's part of your roadmap. Yes.
So I think there are 6 categories of things parents can do that really have a huge impact on their kids' long-term reading success. So conversation is the first one, which we talked about. Just taking turns, the back and forth dialogue, making it a duet, even with infants and toddlers. There are some studies that kids who participate in more back and forth conversations when they were 18 to 24 months old had higher IQs than middle school. So it really is important. And then book reading. So if you can establish that habit, and it doesn't have to be at bedtime, it can be earlier in the day, it can be whenever works for you. But if you can get in the habit of reading the books, but also talking about the themes of the book and pointing out print and all those things, use the book as an easy way to help you teach some of these lessons. Like alphabet books, for example, are a great way to bring kids' attention to print. And teaching,
not to cut you off really quickly, but I think too, it's really important to note that discuss the themes of the book as well, because most parents will just kind of just read the book itself, just reading the words on the page and maybe even point to the words and the letters and everything, but they don't get into the conversation of what is actually being said in those stories and talk about the themes and things. And I think that's also something that we need to focus on, because that's going to help our children with their own recognition of themes and expression of themselves as they get older.
Absolutely. Because our goal in raising readers isn't just that they're able to sound out words on the page. We want them to understand. We want them to think. We want them to develop their own ideas. And asking questions is a great way, just pausing periodically. You don't want to mess up the story, but pausing periodically just to make sure that they're understanding, that they recognize what's going on, that they see the cause and effect within the stories and how things are unfolding. So asking questions. When in doubt, ask a question. Because again, that pause and them having to formulate a response in sentences when they're older, but in coos and babbles when they're babies, remember all that is learning. So definitely ask questions.
And so I know I stopped you in the middle. So what were some of the other
conversation, book reading, teaching.
Yep.
And so again, it can be as simple as that's the letter S. S says it curves this way and that way. And then connecting. I think that parents should build a village or recognize that they have a village that can support them in raising this reader. So that village includes people like your pediatrician who are really familiar with developmental milestones. So they can help you detect early if there is something going on with your child that might become a challenge for them to overcome as a reader. So they might be able to help you recognize if there's a speech issue, because we know language development is intimately tied to literacy development. They can help you in so many ways and sort of refer you to specialists if the need arrives. Also, librarians can help you find wonderful books. If you attend story time at the library, you can see great librarians modeling how to read in an engaging way with kids, and you'll see them asking those questions and building a lot of the skills. So connecting is the fourth one, just recognizing that you don't have to do all of these things alone. Budgeting is the fifth one. And by that, I wanted to be very forthright in the book about the fact that a lot of people are spending money on tutoring to get the reading success that they want. So tutoring is one way that parents can support a reading outcome, but it could also be making the decision between going to a museum and an amusement park, or any of these sort of daily decisions that we're making about how we spend our money, we can spend money in ways that enhance educational experiences and opportunities for our kids. And then the sixth one was advocacy, because often there may come a time when you've done all that you know to do to support your child as a reader. They're in school and they're not getting the support that they need. And so those might be opportunities for you to be the person who agitates for better teacher training or more books in the library or any other thing. So kind of when you get to those points where you've done all you can do, I think it raises our awareness of ways to ask for help and get more systemic support.
And I think that last one is really important for families to understand, because a lot of people will look at a particular school and say, well, this school is high performing because they get all of this support and involvement from parents and the community and so forth. Well, your school can get the same thing. It's just a matter of how you advocate and how you galvanize the other teachers or the other parents in your neighborhood to do the same things, to advocate for your children. If you recognize a particular district or school is high performing, well, there's no secret sauce. Find out what it is that they're doing and you replicate that in your school and so forth. But you get too many people who say, well, I'm going to pull my child out of this school and put them into that high performing school, as opposed to doing what is necessary to get their current school up to the same standards.
And also people have to learn to actually see where their child is relative to expectations. In any school, even in high performing schools, there are some low performing students. So you kind of just have to be sensitive and attentive to what's happening with your child. There's big variation among teachers, even within the same grade level within a school. So I think one big message for parents is just kind of vigilant. But I would say in terms of things that higher performing schools have, one thing that I think is effective that's not directly related to reading skills, but author visits. When schools are able to bring in children's book authors that look like the population of that school, and the child has the opportunity to read the book, get a copy of the book, ask the author questions, things like that it's not easy to quantify the impact of that, but just in my personal experience, I've seen a light really light up in some kids when it becomes that community experience, almost a celebration of books and literature and authors. It's
amazing that you mentioned that, because when I was a principal of a couple of schools, I did that. I was able to bring in the author of the book, and we had an author study and so forth. And when we were able to do that, the students felt, wow, I can actually reach out and touch this person who wrote the book that I'm holding in my hand, because they never had that experience before. So it gave them a whole different connection to it. And one of the other things that I did was I would actually carry a book with me. And especially one of my favorite writers is Walter Dean Myers. So I would walk around with his book and I would read it to some classes. And wouldn't you know that the young men in those classes, after when I was done, they would rush to the library to see if that book was there. And so that sparked that reading, that joy of reading in them, just because they saw me walking around with the book and reading it to them, or they were able to see the authors and so forth. So I think that's something that really we can't overlook too much. But I know we could go on all day with this conversation, and I really enjoyed having you here. So we would definitely like to thank our guest today, award-winning journalist and author of the book, Reading for Our Lives, a literacy action plan from birth to six, Ms. Maya Payne Smart. Thank you for coming on to our show today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Once again, my name is Kevin Boston Hill, and thank you all for listening to Instruction Discussion right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.